You have seen this skyline. You have probably photographed it yourself. Manhattan from the water, a wall of towers at the southern tip, then a long stretch where the buildings drop away to almost nothing. Then, a couple of miles further north, the towers rise again, taller than before. 2 mountains and a valley. It is one of the most recognizable shapes on Earth, and it appears on postcards, in title sequences, on the covers of books about capitalism. And almost everyone who looks at it has been given the same explanation. The bedrock. The story goes like this. Beneath Manhattan lies a hard, ancient stone called schist. In the far south, it sits close to the surface, and at the northern site, it comes close again. But in between, the rock plunges away, hundreds of feet down, buried under sand and clay and old riverbed. You cannot anchor a skyscraper to mud. So the builders put their towers where the rock was and left the valley empty. It is a beautiful explanation. It is geological, which makes it feel like physics rather than opinion. It explains a complicated human pattern with a simple, natural cause. It has been repeated by tour guides, by documentaries, by textbooks, and by the building's own marketing for the better part of a century. And the rock is real. That part is not invented. It has a name. Manhattan schist. It formed under heat and pressure hundreds of millions of years before anything walked on it. And in places, it still breaks through to the surface. There are outcrops in Central Park you can put your hand on, gray and glittering with mica, worn smooth by 150 years of children climbing them. That is the same stone the towers are anchored to. The depth does vary, and it varies dramatically. In some places the rock is a few feet down, in others it is hundreds. So when somebody tells you the skyline sits on that stone, they are not making the stone up. Everything in the story is true, except the conclusion. That is exactly why it is so hard to dislodge. A myth built on a lie can be corrected. A myth built on a fact has to be dismantled. There is only one problem with it. Somebody finally measured it. In 2011, 3 economists published a study in the Journal of Economic History that did something nobody had bothered to do before. They took the depth to bedrock across Manhattan, building by building, and they compared it against where the tall buildings actually went up, between 1890 and 1915. That window matters, because it is exactly when the 2 business districts were forming. They found that bedrock depth does affect construction cost. That part is true. Digging deeper foundations is more expensive, and they put the effect at up to about 7% of the cost of the building. 7%. And then they looked for the thing everyone assumed would be there. A relationship between shallow rock and tall buildings. There wasn't one. Across that entire period, there was no correlation between how deep the bedrock sat and whether a developer chose to build 18 stories or higher. The rock was not deciding anything. Now, before we go further, I want to be careful here, because this is the point where an explanation like this usually overreaches. The study does not say the rock is irrelevant. It says the rock mattered a little, and it mattered far less than everyone believed. And it was not what shaped the skyline. The geology is real. It is just not the author of the story. So if the rock was not deciding, what was? Let's start with the single building that breaks the myth on its own, the Woolworth Building. Completed in 1913, 55 stories. For 17 years it was the tallest building in the world, and it was so ornate that people called it the Cathedral of Commerce. It stands on some of the worst ground in Lower Manhattan, not adequate ground, not compromise ground. Some of the deepest, most difficult foundation conditions on the island. The builders went down through the muck, and they anchored it, and they built the tallest thing on the planet on top of it. If bedrock were the constraint, that building could not exist. And it does exist, and you can walk past it this afternoon. The reason it exists is money, and the numbers are worth sitting with. In 1905, land in the heart of the downtown financial district ran to roughly $72 per square foot. Just north of City Hall, a short walk away, land was going for around $23 per square foot. Same island, same year. Land costing 3 times as much in one place as the other. Now put the foundation cost next to that. Going deeper ran to something in the region of $3,000 for each additional foot of excavation. Do the arithmetic that a developer in 1905 would have done. If land is 3 times cheaper a few blocks north, and the penalty for bad rock is a few $1,000s a foot, then the cheap land wins easily. Overwhelmingly. You could dig a very deep hole indeed and still come out ahead, which raises the question that undoes the whole myth. If the land in the middle was that much cheaper, and the foundation penalty was that small, why did nobody build there? The answer is not in the ground. It is standing on top of it. That valley in the skyline was not empty. It was the most crowded place in the Western world. By 1900, the district between the 2 business centers was packed with recent immigrants, arriving from Europe, moving into tenement blocks 5 stories high. In places, the density reached 1,200 people per acre. 1,200 people on 1 acre. It is worth slowing down there, because that is the kind of number that slides past without landing. An acre is roughly the size of a football pitch. Put 1,200 people on a football pitch, and you have a crowd at a small match. Now, house them on it. Give them walls, and stairwells, and 5 floors with no lift, and a shared privy in the yard, and 1 cold tap for the whole building. That was the arrangement. Families of 6 and 8 in 2 rooms. Interior rooms with no window at all, because the buildings were built to fill every inch of the lot, and nobody was yet enforcing a right to daylight. Photographers eventually went in with flash powder and brought the pictures back out, and the pictures shocked the city that had built the place. And all of it was happening in the middle of the frame. When you look at that skyline photograph, and your eye slides across the low stretch on its way from one cluster of towers to the other, that is what your eye is sliding across. That is not a gap in the city. That is the opposite of a gap. It is the densest concentration of human beings anywhere in the country, and it sat directly in the middle of the 2 most valuable business districts in America. And here is the thing that decided the skyline. Those residents could pay rent for a tenement flat. They could not pay rent for an office floor. A skyscraper is not a monument. It is a machine for collecting rent, and it only makes sense if there is somebody there who will pay commercial rates for the space. In the valley, there wasn't. There were enormous numbers of people, and almost no demand for the kind of floor space a tall building sells. So no developer built one, not because the rock said no, because the ledger said no. And there is one more piece here, which explains why business districts form clumps at all instead of spreading themselves evenly across cheap ground. Offices want to be near other offices. A lawyer wants to be near the courts and near the banks. A bank wants to be near the exchange. A firm that prints financial documents wants to be near the people who will need financial documents printed at 4 in the afternoon, urgently, today. Economists call this agglomeration, and it is one of the strongest forces acting on the shape of any city. What it means in practice is that the value of a location is not really a property of the location. It is a property of who else is already standing there, which is why the two clusters kept getting denser rather than spilling outward into the cheap land between them. The cheap land was cheap precisely because nobody important was on it, and nobody important was going to be the first to move there alone. There is also a simple test you can run on the bedrock story, and it is the kind of test somebody should have run long before anyone measured anything. If the rock were the constraint, then the tall buildings would sit exactly where the rock is shallowest, and nowhere else. The skyline would be a direct print of the geology beneath it, the way a river prints the shape of a valley. It is not. There are places on the island where the stone is close to the surface, and nothing tall was ever built on it. There are places where it is very deep, and enormous towers went up anyway. The pattern of the stone and the pattern of the steel do not match, and once you have noticed that they do not match, you cannot go back to not noticing. The valley in the most photographed skyline on Earth is not a geological feature. It is a demographic one. You are looking at a map of who could afford what, hardened into steel and stone, and left standing for a century. Which leaves the second half of the question, and it is the half that most tellings of this story get wrong even when they get the bedrock part right. Why Midtown? If the money was downtown and the crowds were in the middle, why did a second cluster of towers rise 2 miles north? The usual answer is Grand Central Terminal. The great railway station arrives, the tracks go underground, developers build over them, and Midtown is born. That answer has a timing problem. The tracks at Grand Central were open to the sky until 1913. Before that, the approach was a trench of coal smoke and steam running through the neighborhood. It was not a magnet. It was something you built away from. And by the time the tracks were covered, the northward movement had already been running for decades. To find the real cause, you have to go back much further, to the 1830s, and to a piece of technology so ordinary that it is easy to miss. The horse-drawn omnibus arrives in 1829. The streetcar follows in 1832. Before them, a city was limited by how far a person could comfortably walk. After them, it wasn't, and the first people to use that new freedom were the ones who could afford to. Wealthy New Yorkers began moving north, away from the crowded and increasingly industrial South. Working people stayed where the work was. The city stretched, and the money stretched with it. Historians of the city call this the first inversion. It sounds technical. What it means is that the rich left the center, and everything that serves the rich eventually had to follow them. And follow it did. Through the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, a district grew up around Madison Square. Shops, theaters, restaurants, hotels, the places where people with money spent it. Then the businesses came. Garment manufacturers, who needed to be near the buyers. Insurance companies. Banks. Not because a railway station told them to, but because that is where the customers now were. By around 1880, the district had reached a threshold. Enough commerce had gathered in one place that more commerce wanted to be there too, and the process started feeding itself. And once that happened, land values in Midtown climbed and climbed until they crossed the line where a tall building finally pays for itself. In 1902, the Flatiron Building went up at Madison Square. It was the first true skyscraper north of the downtown district. In 1909, the Metropolitan Life Tower followed, and for a few years it was the tallest building in the world. Grand Central Terminal, in its finished form, arrives after all of this. It did not create Midtown. It confirmed it. It was built where the city was already going, and it accelerated something that was already underway. So here is the skyline, honestly. Two clusters of towers, separated by a dip. The dip is not a bedrock valley. It is the fossil of a slum. The northern cluster is not the child of a railway station. It is the child of shops and theaters, and the people who could afford to move away from the noise. The rock underneath all of it was, at most, a 7% adjustment on the bill. And if you want to know whether that logic still runs, look at what has happened to the skyline in the last 15 years. A third cluster has appeared. Very tall, very thin residential towers along the southern edge of Central Park, several of them among the tallest buildings in the Western Hemisphere, and several of them almost entirely apartments. Nobody put them there because of geology. They are there because that is where the view is, and the view is the product. Somebody worked out how much a person will pay to look down at a park from 600 feet, multiplied it by the number of floors, and built upward until the premium ran out. Same logic as 1890. Same logic as 1902. Find the thing people will pay a premium for, and stack it. The ground did not change. The demand did. And I think the reason the bedrock story survives is not that anyone is lying. It is that it is a much more comfortable thing to say out loud. If the skyline is shaped by geology, then it is nobody's decision. It's just the way the ground is. The towers stand where the earth allowed them to stand, and the empty stretch in between is a fact of nature. If the skyline is shaped by land prices and rent and who could pay it, then it is a record. It says that for decades, 250,000 people lived so densely in the middle of the richest city in the world that nothing profitable could be built above them. That is a harder sentence. It is also the one the evidence supports. The next time you see that photograph, look at the gap. Everyone else is looking at the towers. The towers are the easy part. Somebody wanted them. Somebody paid for them. And they are still there because the arithmetic worked. The gap is where the city tells the truth about itself.